Good morning, welcome to our daily psalm. Today we're reading through Psalm 78. Psalm 78, and I hope you've had your Weetabix this morning, because Psalm 78 is the second longest psalm in the Psalter. It's got 72 verses, so I hope you're sitting comfortably too. Psalm 78 is a history lesson. It urges its readers to beware those ingrained destructive cultural traits, to learn from past mistakes, and to resolve to act differently both in the here and now and for the future. When we read through Psalm 78, we see Israel's rebellion and defiance against God laid out in clinical detail. And the message is clear. Don't behave as your forebears did. Eradicate from your lives their stubborn-heartedness and replace it with faithful, trusting obedience to God. Just to give you an idea of how the psalm is organized, verses 1 to 8 lay out Psalm 78's purpose, which in essence is let the reader listen and submit to God. Then the body of the psalm has brackets at either end, so verses 9 to 11 recall the people's failure, God's people's failure, and at the end, verses 65 to 72, God's choice of a new people for himself. So the psalm does end with some hope. And inside those brackets there are two main sections which review Israel's sorry history. Two TV programs, if you like, of highlights or lowlights of the life of the nation. The first of which follows the years of wandering in the wilderness, and the second as a wider view from rescue in Egypt through to the start of the monarchy. And both sections follow the same pattern. First there's God's wonder-filled acts of grace that are then met with the people's disdain, which in turn is met with God's reluctant chastisement of his people. And as is so often the case with the Psalms, the heart of Psalm 78 is at 78's heart, and the middle verses, 32 to 39, culminate in a description of God's compassion, his forgiveness for his wayward but still beloved people. Psalm 78, here we go. Verse 1, hear my teaching, O my people. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will pour forth mysteries from of old, such as we have heard and known, which our forebears have told us. We will not hide from their children, but will recount to generations to come the praises of the Lord and his power and the wonderful works he has done. You may just have caught there the reference in verse 4 to children. It's the first of four references to children. Psalm 78 is wisdom to invest into the lives of the young. Psalm 78 has the most references to children in any of the Psalms. That's a significant point about it, actually. Verses 5 to 8 are actually a single sentence, so you need to hold your breath and really go for it here. He laid a solemn charge on Jacob and made it a law in Israel, which he commanded them to teach their children, that the generations to come might know, and the children yet unborn, that they might in turn tell it to their children. So this is something to be passed on down the generations. Keep telling this story. Verse 7, so that they might put their trust in God and not forget the deeds of God, but keep his commandments, and not be like their forebears, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God. So the second longest psalm in the Psalter is given specifically for this. It shows how important it is to pass faith on to the younger generation. That's put in positive and negative ways. If you want a reason for why faith should be taught to children, verse 7 says it, so that 1, they might put their trust in God, 2, they might not forget the deeds of God, that they be informed about what's been done, and our task, of course, is to tell children and the next generation about the death and resurrection of Jesus, the mighty deeds of God. And 3, that they might then keep his commandments. They might learn obedience to God in the way they live their lives. And then it's put negatively, and not be like their forebears, not be stubborn and rebellious, not be a generation whose heart is duplicitous, is given elsewhere rather than to God, and whose spirit is not faithful to God, whose spirit is self-absorbed. So, having given the reason why Psalm 78's been written, here we go on into the history lesson. And it starts straight away in verse 9 with the verdict on those breakaway northern tribes of Israel. This is the Ephraim that's been referred to here, verse 9. The people of Ephraim, armed with the bow, turned back in the day of battle. They did not keep the covenant of God. They refused to walk in his law. They forgot what he'd done and the wonders he'd shown them. And now we get the string of the evidence, if you like, of that. The string of miracles, selected highlights of how God led his people away from Egypt and towards the promised land. And we're supposed to think, well, this is, as we read through this, what should come into our minds of God has been so great. How must the people then respond? And let's see. Verse 12, for he, God, did marvelous things in the sight of their forebears, in the land of Egypt, in the field of Zoan. He divided the sea, let them pass through. He made the waters stand still in a heap. He led them with a cloud by day, and all the night through with a blaze of fire. He split the hard rocks in the wilderness. He gave them drink as from the great deep. He brought streams out of the rock. He made water gush out like rivers. God did all this for them, provided for them. Verse 17, yet for all this they sinned more against him and defied the Most High in the wilderness. They tested God in their hearts and demanded food for their craving. That idea of craving, their own inner needs being so dominant in their lives, being what they were concerned for, is going to come up more than once. Verse 19, they spoke against God and said, can God prepare a table in the wilderness? He struck the rock indeed so that the waters gushed out and the streams overflowed, but can he give bread or provide meat for his people? All they're concerned about is their stomachs. It's amazing. The Israelites have seen miracle after miracle as they've been rescued from Egypt and God providing water in the desert of all places, and yet they're still skeptical about whether God can do another miracle. And then comes a double reaction from God. There is understandable anger from him. And should God not get angry when his generosity is so presumed upon, when his people so obviously disparage the agreement that they signed with him? Be respectful of God at the very least. So here's the first reaction, anger. Verse 21, when the Lord heard this, he was full of wrath. A fire was kindled against Jacob, and his anger went out against Israel. For they had no faith in God, and put no trust in his saving help. There's a sense of crushing disappointment in God. What will it take for the people to trust him? Well, he may be angry, but then there's a second reaction. He is a God who provides and cares for his people. So first we get manna, and then we get the quails that he provided for them in the desert. Verse 23, so he commanded the clouds above and opened the doors of heaven. He rained down upon them manna to eat and gave them the grain of heaven. Now the manna, of course, when it was provided, had conditions attached. The people were to collect only 1 day's worth, or 2 on the day before the Sabbath, so they didn't have to work on the Sabbath. So God was creating the conditions for his people to learn to trust him. He's still trying desperately to get them on board. This trust that they desperately lack. And that verse 24, he gave them grain from heaven, is quoted by the skeptics who questioned Jesus just after he's fed 5,000 people, demanding another, a more spectacular miracle. Can you imagine something more spectacular than that? But like their forebears here in Psalm 78, the bigger miracle, when it comes on the cross, was met with the very same skepticism and doubt and questioning that we have here in Psalm 78. Let's see what happens here then in verse 25. So mortals ate the bread of angels. He sent them food in plenty. He caused the east wind to blow in the heavens and led out the south wind by his might. He rained flesh upon them as thick as dust, and winged fowl like the sand of the sea. He let it fall in the midst of their camp, round about their tents. He actually delivered them. This is delivered to your door food by God. He let it fall in the midst of their camp and round about their tents, so that they ate and were well filled, for he gave them what they desired. So they questioned whether God could do this. He's done it. He's laid out for a banquet for them in the desert. Verse 30, but they did not stop their craving. Their mood was still in their mouths when the anger of God rose against them and slew their strongest men and felled the flower of Israel. The result of this concern only for their bellies, their self-centeredness, the Israelites' self-centeredness is shocking. The depth of their stubbornness is staggering. And they pay a very heavy price for it. God, it seems, has no option but to take drastic action to try to bring them back on board as his people. And surely now, after seeing the best of their youngest men slain, now surely now there'll be a change of heart. Verse 32. But for all this, they sinned yet more, and put no faith in his wonderful works. So he brought their days to an end like a breath, and their years in sudden terror. Whenever he slew them, they would seek him. They would repent and earnestly search for God. They remembered that God was their rock and the Most High their Redeemer. Well, yes, but the next verse, verse 36, yet they did but flatter him with their mouth and dissemble with their tongue. Their heart was not steadfast towards him, neither were they faithful to his covenant. Their repentance, you see, was shallow, their words empty, meaningless. But God's forbearance and restraint are astonishing. Here we get to the central heart of Psalm 78, verse 38. But he, God, was so merciful that he forgave their misdeeds and did not destroy them. Many a time he turned back his wrath and did not suffer his whole displeasure to be roused. For he remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passes by and does not return. You can picture behind these words the words of God spoken through the prophet Hosea. What shall I do with you, O Ephraim? How can I give you up? You turn your back on me time and time and time again. You ignore me when I provide for you. What am I supposed to do? Well, God forgives and forgives and forgives. And we'll see what he does a bit later on. But for now, in Psalm 78, we have to go back to Historical Highlights program number 2. And all it does is reveal the same pattern. Here's verse 40. How often they rebelled against him in the wilderness and grieved him in the desert. Again and again they tested God, they vexed the Holy One of Israel. God is not immune to the frustration that he feels. Israel's stubbornness and insolence caused God's grief and pain. Verse 42, they, the people, did not remember his power in the day when he redeemed them from the enemy. In their minds, you see, it was as though that great rescue from slavery had never happened. I guess the equivalent for us would be if we forgot the cross, if we simply, unthinkingly, just enjoy the benefits of the cross without any thought for the price of winning it, of winning those benefits for us. And if we did that, if we just said, well, we'll enjoy the good bits, thank you very much, but we don't need to concern ourselves with what it costs God to give us this relationship with him, well then our relationship with him would veer very wildly off course, wouldn't it? So verse 42, they did not remember his power in the day when he redeemed them from the enemy, how he'd wrought his signs in Egypt, his wonders in the field of Zoan. He turned their rivers into blood so that they could not drink of their streams. He sent swarms of flies among them which devoured them, and frogs which brought them ruin. We're getting a rehearsal here of the plagues. Verse 46, he gave their produce to the caterpillar, the fruit of their toil to the locust. He destroyed their vines with hailstones and their sycamore trees with the frost. He delivered their cattle to hailstones and their flocks to thunderbolts. He set loose on them his blazing anger, fury, displeasure and trouble, a troop of destroying angels. He made a way for his anger and spared not their souls from death, but gave their life over to the pestilence. He even smote the firstborn of Egypt, the first fruits of their strength in the tents of Ham. All the way through, he, God did all this for his people, acts of irresistible power against the enemy. But when it came to his own people, verse 52, a gentle hand for his own flock. Verse 52, but he led out his people like sheep. He guided them in the wilderness like a flock. He led them to safety, and they were not afraid, but the sea overwhelmed their enemies. He brought his people to his holy place, the mountain which his right hand took in possession. He drove out the nations before them. He shared out to them their inheritance. He settled the tribes of Israel in their tents. Again, we get this he. God did all of this. A beautiful, touching picture of God coaxing his beloved people from all their brokenness in Egypt to their own home where they could be free from fear. So surely now all would be well. Well, sadly not. Unbelievably, nothing's changed. Those ingrained ingratitude, it's breathtaking and heartbreaking. Verse 56. Yet still they tested God Most High and rebelled against him and would not keep his commandments. They went away and were disloyal like their forebears. They turned like a bow that cannot shoot straight. Useless, isn't it, if you shoot with an arrow and it veers off course? Verse 58, they grieved him with their hill altars, provoked him to displeasure with their idols. You see, things have gotten worse than it was before. Previously, Israel rebelled against God. Well, now they abandoned him. They turned to worship other gods, idols that they've made with their own hands. Verse 59, God heard and was greatly angered, no wonder, and utterly rejected Israel. He forsook the tabernacle at Shiloh, the tent of his presence on earth. He gave the ark of his strength into captivity, his splendor into the adversary's hand. This is where the ark is captured by the Philistines, and its departure from the Israelites is mirrored by God's own withdrawal from them. Verse 62, he delivered his people to the sword. He raged at his inheritance. We get three more he's here. But whereas back in verses 43 to 55, God did everything to bring his people to safety, now he acts to cause the defeat of his people. That's all that's left, is to abandon them to their rebelliousness. This is utterly tragic. Verse 63, the fire consumed their young men. There was no one to lament their maidens. Their priests fell by the sword. Their widows made no lamentation. The whole people now, not just the young men as it had been previously, all of them are being destroyed one by one by one. Now we would understand if the story ended here. We've had the history lesson. Hopefully we've learned what we're supposed to learn. Israel made its choices. Over and over again, it chose to reject God, to refuse him, to ignore him. And now they've had to reap the consequences of their decisions. Israel made bad choices. And now God, well, God has other ideas. He makes some other choices. 3 choices, in fact, as we'll read in a moment. His first choice is for the unfashionable, rather hesitant tribe of Judah, as opposed to those rebellious tribes in the north. Judah has not a mighty man among them. Choice number 2 is for Zion, to be his home. It's currently in enemy hands, so that's not a great choice either, seemingly. Third choice is to take someone who will be a man after his own heart. Someone who's not obviously first choice, a shepherd boy, but he's someone who knows a thing or two about how to care for the things of God. And God gives to him the job of shepherding his people. So 3 choices which are not the obvious ones, but God's tried the obvious ones. Is verse 65. Then the Lord woke as out of sleep, like a warrior who'd been overcome with wine. He struck his enemies from behind. He put them to perpetual shame. He rejected the tent of Joseph and chose not the tribe of Ephraim, so he's abandoning the people in the north, but he chose the tribe of Judah and the hill of Zion, which he loved. And there he built his sanctuary like the heights of heaven, like the earth which he founded forever. He chose David also, his servant, and took him away from the sheepfolds. From following the ewes with their lambs, he took him, that he might instead shepherd Jacob his people, and Israel his inheritance. He's putting a lot of trust in this boy David, isn't he? His king to be. Verse 72, so he, David, shepherded them with a devoted heart, and with skillful hands he guided them. And there the history lesson finishes, and ends really with the story unfinished. And although it's optimistic in the way that last verse reads, of course, sadly, history would repeat itself. The chosen tribe of Judah will also refuse God's chosen king. But David, this shepherd boy, becomes the model for the greater king, the greatest of all kings. And we learn from Israel's shame, laid out so glaringly in Psalm 78, that instead we should welcome that chosen and greatest king, and commit, unlike them, to trust and obey him. Well done if you've made it to the end of this very long psalm, very powerful psalm. Let's take a moment to pray. O God, our shepherd, would you grant us the humility to learn from our forebears, to eradicate those cultural destructive tendencies that we may have adopted, to put aside our temptation to rebel against you, to look simply to satisfy the cravings of our stomachs. And instead, in all our wanderings and temptations, will you teach us to rest in your mercy, to trust in your defense, to look for your provision, and to be guided by the Good Shepherd, who laid down his life for us, even Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.